Hi all, welcome to Machine Coding Interview. I am Sanjay and in this course we will discuss highlights of bill sharing system. So what new things we have learned in this application? So first thing we have learned is builder design pattern. So how we are using this builder design pattern in our application? So let's open the code base. So in the application we have this builders directory where we have the expense builder. So in the expense builder we are creating the expense object. Okay, so how we are creating the expense object? By using this build method. Okay, so whenever we want to create any expense object, first we have to call this static method, which is new expense, which will be creating the expense builder object, and on that expense builder object we have to set all the required properties. Okay, so we have all these setters, okay, which will be setting the properties, but out of these setters we have to use only those setters which are required in a particular business case, right? We may use all the setters, we may not use all the setters. So after setting all these properties in the expense builder setter, we will call this build method. And once we call this build method, what it will internally do, it will create the expense object, and in that expense object, it will set all the properties and it will give us the expense object. Let's see how we are using this in our application. So just search this new expense, and here you can see that we are using that in the expense service. So in the expense service, first we are calling this static method new expense, which will be giving us the expense builder object. In that expense builder object we are setting the required properties, and then we are calling the dot build method, which will give us the expense object. So that's how we use the builder class. So the main advantage of using the builder class is you can set whatever property you want. Okay, so it is different from the factory's design pattern, because in factory design pattern we have to pass all the required properties, and factory design pattern is used for creating simple objects, and this builder design pattern is used for the complex objects in the sense, if you have lots of properties, more than 10 properties, and only few properties are required, then you should be using the builder design pattern. But if all the properties are required properties, then you should be using the factory design pattern. Okay, now the next highlight is in-memory database. So for running the test cases, we are using the in-memory database. So here you can see that we have all these test methods. Okay, this all the test methods are calling the controllers, and then the controller is calling the repository. This repository is saving the data in the database. But in our test cases, we are not saving any data in the database, but we are saving the data in this H2 memory. Means the H2 engine has this in-memory database, and the database name is testdb. So this is a logical database where it will be storing all the data. Okay, and in the application.properties you can see that we are using the actual database, which is the PostgreSQL database, right? So by using the in-memory database, we can make our test case very fast, because it will not be interacting with the database and it will be using its own in-memory database. The third is the REST API. So if you'll open any controller, then we are following all the REST conventions. Okay, so our API controller should be starting with the API and then the resource name. After the resource name, whatever APIs we are creating, whatever endpoints we are creating, remember that those endpoints should be talking in terms of the resources. So here we have the expenses, and if you want to create any object inside the expenses, then it should be API expenses slash that object name. If you want to get a particular object inside expenses, then it should be API expenses that object slash ID. Okay, so here you can see that there is no verb involved in the endpoints. So you can see this method get mapping. So the complete URL would be API expenses user and user ID. So by using this API expenses user and user ID, we will get all the users for a particular expense. Let's open the group controller. So in the group controller also, the starting URL is API groups. And now in the API groups, you can see that we have this ID participants. Means API groups slash ID participants will be used for adding the participants inside this group. Okay, so here we are making the admins. So we are making the admins for a particular group, and here we have the expenses. Means inside group we are adding the expenses, and inside group there is a settlement object. right? This can be improved more, okay, because this setup is kind of a word, and in rest endpoint we talk in terms of the resources. So generally we avoid the verbs in the rest endpoint urls. So here we are getting the balance, here we are getting the total balance, okay, and here we are settling up a particular object. In the user controller we have api users, and in the api users you can see that we have this mail and we have this phone which is part of the user. So that's how we create the rest endpoint urls. We don't include the verbs here, it should include only the resource name or properties name inside the http endpoints. The next is component and service annotations. So if you see these services, all the services have the services annotations just above the class name, right? So here just above the class name you can see that we have used the service annotation. What does it mean? So it means whatever class it is, it will be treated as a service. Service is a kind of component, means whenever we start our application, one bean of this settlement service will be created and it will be stored in the app container. So the same thing will be done here. One bean of group service will be created and it will be stored in the app container. So whenever we want to use that object, whenever we want to use that bean, just auto add that bean like this in the constructor, okay, or you can simply create a private variable and annotate it with the auto add variable, and then the application will get that bean from the application container, right? By default scope of a particular bean in spring boot is singleton, but you can change the scope of a bean to prototype also. So in the same way we have the component annotation. So let's find where we are using component. So yeah, here you can see paid by factory. In paid by factory we are using this component annotation. So this component annotation is also used for creating a bean, okay. So whenever you want to create a singleton object in the spring boot framework, then you annotate that object by using the component service or repository. This component service, repository, rest controller, this all are the component by default with some additional functionality. Spring Boot create the beans of these classes and stores them in the app container, and it is used whenever we call the auto-var annotation or whenever we use the constructor injection. Okay, so yeah, that's all from the highlights. See you in the next class.